I have a deep space background, so
Right.
that I really like, but I couldn't figure out how to do it on this. So I was like,
Right. Normally I'm in deep space, guys, but I can't.
yeah.
I guess I'll just be at my house. So funny. I'll give everybody a second to come. And I'm actually going to turn off the way we narrate now, right? We narrate everything we're doing. It's like, let me do the like this.
Yeah.
My students,
Running commentary for my entire life. Yes, exactly.
my entire life. My students muted me an hour ago and I'm still like, hold on, let me share my, they do not care. Like they're not even on the call anymore. Like I need to give it up. It's like, yeah, it's like a one-woman show, like crickets, and I'm still going like, yeah, we're still here. Okay. No, we're over it. Yesterday was our last day of school, so.
Oh, congratulations! Yay!
Like we survived somehow. I was still getting grade emails this morning, and I was like, oh, honey, like I posted yesterday. Like we're not.
Yeah, like this dog's dead, honey.
Yeah, right. Like that ship has sailed. Like no, not what we're doing. But what are you gonna do? They're like, oh, okay, I just thought I'd try. Yeah, me too. No, like not happening. All right, here we go. Yay, we've got some repeat attenders. Kelly Sita, I see you. Yes. We've got Lila Amaryllis. Yes, Tori's here. Awesome. And Robin. Fantastic. Well, let's rock and roll. Yay. Kelly. And you could rename, I think this time, Kelly. Wait, oh no, you cannot. Sorry. Wade, my Zoom, it's like my school Zoom. So I keep my school Zoom a Zoom tomb. So I'm like, sorry, no one has the power to do anything. So
exactly. Love it.
Because, students. So yeah, like, gosh, I'm, man, closing down the Zoom here after yesterday. Incredible. So man, what a year. And we've got a yes I can. Yes, I don't hate it. Also, yes I can. I hope you're real because you can't do anything. So if we're getting Zoom bombed, good luck to you. No, I'm teasing. But welcome everybody. I know a lot of you have been here before. So we can, if you are not familiar with Zoom, you can do a couple of things. Like up to the right, like upper right-hand corner, you can adjust the view. So you can do like speaker view, gallery view. We've got kind of a mix of camera on, camera off, that kind of thing. So totally up to you, obviously. And we are recording, so this will be available later. So if you miss something, we can come back and just on that same original link, I'll post the video and all that kind of good stuff. So you get our good running commentary at the beginning. So you're welcome. But if you haven't been, my name is Meredith White. I teach Spanish just outside of Atlanta in Gwinnett County. And our last day was yesterday. So now we're in post-planning, heavily into post-planning, which means posting grades, emailing about grades, double checking about grades, and doing all the checklist stuff. So tiring nonetheless. But I'm excited to have Wade here because Wade, I've followed your work and different, like, I know we're in some of the same like social media groups. So I've seen you like post things and whatever, and I've known your name for a while, but I'm excited to be able to like connect because you've been we keep like passing kind of in the same sort of radar thing, but I've never gotten to like meet you formally. So I'm really excited about this. And I know where you are, but will you tell us where you are and what you're teaching this year?
Oh, absolutely. Oceanagad, or hola a todos, or dajiahao, or bonjour.
Nailed it.
Wade Blevins. Wade Blevins, Dawadon, Yonegagantino, Unole, Dawadon, Oklahoma Janelle, Jalagia Yetli Dagilastone. My name is Wade, and I work for Cherokee Nation as a curriculum specialist and sort of ad hoc teacher. And I live here in Oklahoma, so I work for Cherokee Nation in Oklahoma. And I'm just really, really excited. Galiele Chigedo Kousa. I'm really glad to be here this evening. So,
man, and I have so many friends. I told a couple of my friends from Oklahoma. I think Enid. Am I pronouncing that like the name?
Enid? Right? Yes.
Okay. Enid, and I can't remember Ava, Oklahoma, Ava, something.
Ada.
Yeah, Ada. Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
I got a friend, a teaching friend, one from Enid and one from Enid and one from Ada. Yes. And both of them were like, oh, cool. That's really neat. And they, like, oh, well, we had at my school, this was offered anyway. And they had lots to say, but it made me realize how much I don't know about like being like either residing on or teaching in or being a part of a nation. Could you kind of tell us like what that means, what that includes?
Oh, absolutely. Well, Oklahoma, we are very unique in that originally our state was set up as one giant reservation. We were kind of the dumping ground for all these tribes. And so they brought tribes from east of the Mississippi, they brought tribes from up north, they brought tribes from the West Coast, they brought tribes from the Northern Plains, and they brought them all here. And so we are the inheritors of that. And so as a result of that, we have 39 tribes that have their official seat of government here. We're considered to be domestic dependent nations. So we have our own sovereignty. However, we are domestic dependent. So we are within, the parameters of the United States government. Oklahoma, we became a state in 1906, which effectively did away with our tribal governments and our tribal sovereignty. And then it wasn't until probably about the 1960s, the 1970s, that our governments got to kind of restart and we got to exercise more of our tribal sovereignty. And so we've been plugging away at it. And then, of course, for those of you that follow such things, the McGirt case reestablished the reservations for 5 of us here in Oklahoma, which is Cherokee Nation. We were one of them. Up until then, we didn't have what was, a reservation. We had what was called tribal jurisdictions. So we're unique in that, reservations, for example, like up north, they're fairly insulated and they're fairly kind of like in a bubble, whereas we were integrated. It was kind of a patchwork, this patch of land would be tribal land, the patch, the acre right next to it would be, state land. And that kind of thing. So, Salamanca, skin on. Awesome.
I was just about to say, I was gonna be like, Tori's in the house and she's on Seneca at her school. They teach Seneca and Spanish. Yeah.
I've been to Salamanca many times. Because our tribe neighbors the Seneca Cugis here in Oklahoma. So I've grew up around the Seneca Cugis here and was a ceremonial singer for them when I was young. And so I've been to Salamanca a few times, and I love it there. The Old Bridge Singers, and I love going up there.
Man, super cool. Well, and like there's so much, like you're just saying, there's so much historical context and like there's so much like just that goes into understanding the community and like where you are and like why, all of that, which is so interesting and so erased from many of our teaching settings and where we live and all that kind of thing. I guess, what are the other languages available? Like, what are the languages taught where you are? Any other sort of less commonly taught languages, or is it one?
Mostly, most public schools, most of our kids, I would say probably 95% of our tribal kids are public schooled. Most of them are exposed to Spanish. That's their choice, but we're slowly trying to change that and offer Cherokee as a second language in schools for credit other than elective credit. That's one of the things that we're really working toward, and we've been so fortunate that the State Department of Education here in Oklahoma, our past World Languages Director, who was Dessa Dawson, who you might know as the past ACTFL president, and a really good friend of mine, and so I love her to death. And we're really fortunate that she had the foresight to really try and bridge that gap between what indigenous languages were doing and the issues that we're facing here in the state as far as languages other than English. Of course, I'm sure some of you, knowing the states you come from, are in very similar situations, you know, whereas any language other than English is not valued perhaps as much as they are in other places. And here in the state of Oklahoma, we're really experiencing some issues with teachers, finding teachers. Young people are not entering not only the teaching field in general, but particularly world language programs. And so schools are, we don't have enough teachers to teach. We have a state mandate that world language has to be taught, and not enough teachers to do the job. You know, so she was really, really smart in that she was like, well, hey, you know, we have all these tribes right here and they're all doing language revitalization work. Let's try to work together to put something together, you know. So I just have so much respect for her, and she's just really a visionary and fabulous person. So
Yeah, right. Like overall, just a fabulous person. Joe, I don't know if you can see Joe, he's laughing in the corner because he and I traveled to Cuba with Dessa. And
oh wow.
yeah, like it was the actual EF Cuba trip. And by the end, I said in the chat, I was like, Joe, shut up. You're not allowed to say anything in the chat. Because by the end of the trip, I was a little short on money. Like, the money that you take to Cuba is all the money you have in Cuba. So like I budgeted pretty darn close, but the last day had to borrow $20 from Dessa Dawson. And she was actual president at the time, and he was like, "Oh my god, you know, like you're so embarrassing." And I was like, "Dessa, can I have some more?" You know, like it was so embarrassing. But I paid her back.
That's awesome.
Well, so embarrassing. Oh my god. But she's incredible. But that sounds just like her too, is like having, like you said, the foresight to go, well, why don't we just, you know, this makes sense. And, you know, being in the context and having like so much classroom experience too. And I think that's, you know, people sometimes get in those positions where they're telling us how to do what it is we do, and they've forgotten how it is to do what we do, especially after this year. Like if we thought the gap was big before, now that we've taught in a pandemic, you know, that has affected different communities in way different ways. I mean, and then the nuance within that, and then just like all of the layers, it's really helpful to have people like that who understand like the struggles and the wins and just all of the ups and downs within a community, especially with again, less commonly taught languages from less represented communities. So
absolutely.
Awesome. Of course she did.
Yeah, of course, right? Yeah, she's just an amazing person. So
yeah, no, absolutely. Well, when you look at professional, I guess when you look at, I'll go backwards a little bit. So ignore that. When you look at kind of like you mentioned the word revitalizing, and to me, kind of revitalizing is like bringing back life, right? Like vitality. It's like putting life back into that language and that community and preserving. There's like preservation, but also, you know, kind of uplifting and renewing and all those kind of things. When you have a less commonly taught language like Cherokee, what does that work look like? What does it look like to revitalize a language in the confines of like a program, like within school or schooling?
Well, it really is such a multifaceted task to do, because when you talk about revitalization, we're talking about not only getting people to acquire enough language so that they can be conversant and that so that they can, you know, communicate in the language, but revitalization also means that we have things there for them to do, because, you know, it's not like commonly taught languages or other world languages that are very strong in that you have TV shows, you have radio shows, you have, you know, magazines, you have ads. I mean, you can look at anything that's communicative and find it in your language. And in our language, we just don't have that anymore. And so we're having to look forward and be cognizant of, you know, we need TV shows, we need children's shows, we need like telenovelas, in our language and things. I mean, how cool would that be? Although it'd probably be pretty dry because we're pretty laid back people. But
it'd be nearly as dramatic, but I like it.
But and we need for like our language, we're lucky in that we have an orthography, we have our syllabary. But really, the only thing that people had in their homes was the Bible that was written in our language. And so I would say probably 90% of first language Cherokee speakers that can also read and write, they will all tell you that's where I learned to read and write, was by using the Bible, because that's the only thing they had. That's the only written material that was available. And of course, if you follow the work of Dr. Stephen Krashen, and the importance of voluntary reading and FVR and things like that, we don't have that. We don't have fiction, we don't have nonfiction, we don't have informational, there's nothing for people to read. And so revitalization is also providing that kind of input and enrichment as well. So there, teachers in schools, they don't have a library, they can't say, okay, take 5 minutes to do FVR, because there's nothing for them to read. So I was so happy to see the work of a lot of teachers that I would go to their workshops, and it's like how to create a library basically out of nothing. And I was like, oh, this is great, this is perfect.
Good, nothing. That's what I have. I can handle nothing. Right. No, well, and I mean, that's so true. Like, we joke about, or I should say, I and a couple of friends will joke about like conferences, because we're Spanish teachers. We are a dime a dozen, and sessions for us are a dime a dozen. Like if you want to look, and I'm sure, I think Kelly and I have talked about it in a couple of, like, if you want to look for a secondary high school Spanish session, there's going to be somebody who's like, woohoo, 100 games in 100 minutes, how to organize your files, like whatever it is. And we're like, ding, like that kind of commonly taught language, professional development, and material privilege is so real, because the second you talk to anybody who teaches, Mandarin, Arabic, Japanese, any kind of like Native American language, like ASL, we were talking earlier this week, like all of that, it's like, yeah, we've got a couple of vendors, because those are the only people who are able to provide materials. And that's stuff that I think for me as a really privileged thing that I can forget about, if that makes sense. Like that's the privilege of being able to go like choose from resources and not just not have, things that I can use, or, authentic resources or print, like you said, literally things to read. Do you think there's in those resources, or in creating those resources, do you see any gatekeeping in terms of that you perceive of, for example, like if we're looking at, let's say, like Own Voices, the push to, and rightfully so, have, the stories told by people who can really speak to those stories, literally and figuratively stories, in, when you look at a language like Cherokee, or maybe even Seneca, or, maybe Tori or her colleague can chime in too in the chat, like, is there any kind of gatekeeping like we see sometimes with native speakers writing about this, but maybe I wouldn't be able to speak to something happening in Chile, I've never been there, that kind of a thing. Does that exist in that, does that stop anybody from creating materials, do you think?
I think that's a yes and a no. In that, as far as, especially with our tribe, everybody, I mean, I'm sure every single person here knows somebody who, is Cherokee. I mean, or has that story in their past, and so because of that, I think Cherokee Nation, the United Kituwa Band, and the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians are very, very cognizant of that, and there's a lot of misinformation about our people because, you know, there are just, if you do any kind of Google search about Cherokee anything, you know, probably the first 15 things that you're going to find are, chances are, not accurate, you know. So because of that, we're I think the tribe is trying to be really careful about who they allow to tell and what they allow them to tell. But by the same token, it's just, there's so much, I mean, you know, there's so many of us. And that's great and bad, you know. So because we're lucky, a lot of tribes maybe only have, you know, you can count the number of speakers on one hand, you know. We're fortunate in that we have roughly about 2,000 first language speakers that Cherokee was their first language, and they learned English later. So however, the downside of that is they're all above the age of 55, and most of them are above the age of 65, you know. So for example, during this whole COVID thing, we lost well over 100 speakers just during this time period, you know. And that doesn't sound like a lot, you know, when you think about, but when you think about how many speakers we have, you know, it's an incredible number of speakers, and an incredible number of incredible amount of knowledge that we have lost, you know. So
Right. I mean, it's like the age and the experience, and it's like when you lose like a, or it seems, tell me if this is an inappropriate comparison, but like it seems like when you lose, I recently lost our family, in our family recently, the oldest cousin of my dad's generation recently passed away, and it feels like we'll never, if you didn't hear those stories, or if you didn't hear, like, that's it, she's the only one that knows X, and now X is kind of lost with it. Do you feel like it's the same kind of thing, like with with a group of people? I mean, that's a significant percentage. You know, 100 people, like there is something significantly lost there, culturally, familially, linguistically, etc.
Oh, definitely linguistically, especially when those olders, you know, well, it's like any language, you know, it evolves and changes. So our speakers that are in their 80s and 90s, the way that they speak is different than those younger ones that are in their 50s and 60s, because the ones that are in their 50s and 60s, even though they speak and they think in Cherokee, they're still influenced by the predominant language, which is English in some ways. Whereas those older ones, last year we lost our last monolingual Cherokee speaker. He spoke no English, all he spoke was Cherokee, you know. And when I was a kid growing up, I knew a lot of monolingual Cherokee speakers. I knew several, and they're all gone now, you know, just in my lifetime, they're all gone, you know. So for example, something that would, you know, if I had a sentence that I wanted to translate into English or into Cherokee from English, and I go to, you know, a younger speaker, they might give me 2 or 3 sentences to make that understandable in our language. If you go to somebody in their 80s or 90s, they can do that whole sentence in one single word, because they're that amazing at it, you know. They're just, the way that they can manipulate our language is being lost, you know. And so, and maybe that's okay. I mean, you know, I mean, it is what it is, right? You know. And our language is considered to be one of the most complicated languages for speakers of English to pick up, because it's so radically different. Where those of the Seneca speakers, you know, can relate, because we're a verb-based language, and we use affixes, and most of the Haudenosaunee languages are very much the same, you know. So and so just those younger speakers, they're just not able to manipulate those affixes the same way that those older speakers can. And now we have generation of second language learners like myself, and then we have our immersion school kids who English was their first language, and they speak English at home because their parents aren't speakers. And so now the language is morphing even again, you know. So because um, they're completely informed by their first language, of course, by the way their brain functions and the way that they think, the way they process information. And so when they speak Cherokee, it's even different than, you know, people in my generation, you know. So so it's wild.
I'm thinking back too, like I can remember I was talking about this recently as a well, you're making me think of all the conversations we have like on Twitter and Lang Chat and as language teachers, just like all, you know, all the time that we're just having all the time about, you know, what's really a word? What constitutes a word? Who does it? Well, but this blah 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 says blah blah blah. But like if people say el lonche, you know, for lunch, who are we to go like it's almuerzo, you know, or whatever? And I'm like, okay, you know, and all that kind of thing. So it's yeah, like some really similar obstacles is not the word, but like reflections, conversations, like really concrete things that a lot of it seems to me a lot of language communities are having of like this versus this, but just the natural evolution of language, like generationally, is fascinating. And you know, who's to say, like you said, it is what it is. Like who's to say that's valuable, less valuable, more valuable? But it's fascinating when you say when you phrase it like that, because in my ignorance, I would not have thought of that would not have occurred to me as a common thing that we could say. And having learned Spanish as a non-native speaker, you know, as a second, as an additional language, I often feel like, oh, who am I to say what's a word and what's not a word? You know, if I've got kids who are like, okay, pues voy para mi lonche, you know, and I'm like, yeah, great, me too. Like,
Yeah,
I'm
like,
not,
totally.
I'm not thinking anything about that, but you know, you either teach with people or you're friends with people, like whatever, that would say, you need to teach him this word, or it's this word versus this word. And I never thought about that, just kind of really being lost to a degree with the loss of people, obviously, you know, for a lot of times in the conversations that I'm in, and, you know, in a commonly taught language with Spanish, it's just kind of like age and those hip new young rascals are just and like bilingual speakers, you know, all those kind of factors where it's you've got, you know, people using language in duality. But man, like literally losing people is loss of language. Again, literally.
Yeah.
That's wow. That's a lot.
One of the teachers that I work with a lot, she's well, let's see, she's my mom's age, so she's 70, in her 70s, early 70s. Her mother is still living, you know, so her mother's in her 80s, late 80s, early 90s, and her mother is now suffering from dementia, you know. And so when I would work with her, because I'm a second language learner, I always try to double check and triple check everything that I put out, because there's, you know, because I'm a second language learner, you know, this was my grandpa's first language, but it was not mine, you know. So and my grandpa's passed, you know. So so I would ask her, and sometimes she'd be like, well, let me ask my mom, you know. And now she can't do that, and so she's feeling that. And there was another old man who was older than her, who lived in their community, and if they came across words or concepts that neither of them, then they would go to him, and because he would know, you know, because he was a monolingual speaker, you know. And so they'd be like, well, we'll ask him, and now he's gone. And so with every single person that's passing, there's just there, I guarantee there's knowledge that no one else holds that's being lost as well, you know.
Man, again, I think back to like, you know, family members and family stories and all of those kind of things where it's like, you know, once you lose, yeah, with those people goes something really sacred. And when it's, you know, typically, and when it's linguistic, you're like, wow, we'll just never know what they would have said for this. Or yeah, I mean, that's a profound loss. And especially being embedded in the community, like being monolingual within the community, like being able to be consulted is such an interesting aspect of that too, instead of like what I would say as a Spanish teacher, like, let me go ask my native speaker friend. But how long have they lived here? Because I live here in Georgia. Like, how long have they been here? How long? There's going to be still some out of the community aspect. And I don't mean that like in a critical way, but my Chilean colleague, who's great, you know, she'll say, I don't know, I don't think we have a word for that. But maybe I've seen it, you know, with my phone in Spanish or something. Like there's something where I'm like, oh, I think there's a word, but like you've
Right.
lived here for 30 years. Like, why would you know, that cultural aspect necessarily? So it's a lot of nuance there. But like you said, the people being in the community, let me go ask so and so, is like a more immediate
Yeah.
loss.
And that's such a great point that you just brought up, in that uh, in any language, for example, with speakers of Spanish, if they moved here when they were 5, as opposed to when they moved here if they were 30,
Mhm.
the amount and the complexity of language that they were exposed to is going to be different. And it's the same with our speakers. I was trying to do a little kids song, because I'm right now I'm really into children's songs, because I have a daughter, she's 7, so I'm all into songs. and but I was translating a Czech song called Chichechku Chichechku, and it was about this little linnet, a bird who and it was about the process of growing and processing poppy to make flour or to make bread. And so I was like, well, that would be really cool if we did that about corn, because corn is so important to us, you know? And so I started going to my speakers, and I'd be like, okay, well, how do we say the corn ripens? How do we say we gather the corn? How do we say we shuck the corn? How do we say we dry it? How do we say that we grind it? And some of them, they were like, well, you can say this. They were like, but I remember my grandparents had one specific word that meant only to harvest corn. You could not use it to harvest anything else. It was one word that was only to harvest corn, but it was a very, very specialized vocabulary that, of course, younger speakers were not exposed to until much later in life. And so, once they entered school and they stopped using Cherokee as their primary mode of communication, then a lot of that knowledge then kind of stopped for them. So they would have to go and ask the older people, and as they're leaving us, that's becoming harder and harder to come across. And so we're lucky in that we have speakers who that's their passion, is bringing back those old archaic words that you may use 10 times in a lifetime, right? But we have to have that, and that's an important aspect of revitalization. However, those kinds of people oftentimes aren't good teachers of the language, because they're so into these minute, archaic words that's what they want to do. They're like, oh, I'm going to teach you this word for which you can only use in one specific set of circumstances. And so we're lucky in that we have all those kinds of people to come together. The trick is finding where all of those people fit, and not being upset and realizing that we all have important jobs to do, and that we all have to work together, and that together we make a language community. And together, that's how it, even the part of people like me as a second language learner, we have, and I'm sure those that are up around Ojibwe country or Seneca country can relate to sometimes the conflict that arises between first language speakers and second language learners. Because for us, we don't even have the concept of a second language speaker now. We have first language speakers and we have second language learners, and you will always be a second language learner forever. Which is cool. I mean, I love to be a learner, so I'm happy to be a learner. But there is that conflict, whereas first language speakers, they're like, well, you shouldn't be teaching because you're a second language learner, you don't know, but by the same token, most of our first language speakers are older. They don't have the teaching background, so they're paras. And so whenever you start talking about methodology and things, like CI and things like that, they kind of shut down. And because of their own negative experiences in the traditional school system, maybe they were in boarding school or things like that. So you start talking something about like how to teach, and they're like, that's not important. It's just, I talk to them in Cherokee, they're gonna pick it up.
They'll be fine.
Yeah, it'll be fine. Yeah, it'll work.
That sounds like cranky relatives, like, oh, they'll be fine. You're like, but also that's funny. Well, man, I mean, I'm always surprised by, not always, I tend to be surprised by some of those conversations anyway, like of what language matters, because, I say jokingly, like, cranky elders, but like that's tale as old as time, the language difference between age groups, in your family. Like, how many times did you try on, something like some new slang for size, like in middle school, and your grandparents were like, what is he? How many times do we say as teachers, I'm like, I have no idea what the children are saying. Like, I don't. They're saying things like bet, lit, fi. I'm like, you keep saying 3-letter words I don't understand in English. Like, this is my first language. So it's funny when it goes, as not funny, but it just like surprises me every time when it goes a step further, and people can't see those parallels between, like you said, like generationally and also just contextually. So now suddenly we're saying which language matters, or which language is understandable, or which language is valid. If a second, would you say a second, like a learner, a perpetual forever learner is using it and understandable and trying to also bridge some of those gaps, like you said, like at what point, would somebody go, no, sorry, that's not the word and that's not good enough or whatever. But we have a lot of teachers who are like that. It's this way or this way. It's this or this. And it's assigning value. It's assigning perceived value to language, which is really hard to do. And yet we've all done it, and
Right.
we've said like, no, this one's better than this. More people, I have to really watch myself. I don't remember who was tweeting about it, but it's been in this past year. And it really got me thinking about the way we phrase, like, oh, like different words for things. You can say calcetines or medias for socks, like either one of those, just depending really on kind of where you are, who you're talking to, whatever, both valid, but really reframing how I present that. So like, I tend to use calcetines because I was taught, I primarily interact with these people, but you may, not assigning importance, because before I would have said most people say, but like based on 0 numbers, like I have no data to like support. Most people use made up statistics, like most who people, like whatever, like, and so things like that. And the kids ask for words like leggings. I'm like, I don't know, just say tall socks, because that's basically their socks masquerading as pants, things like that. Like, it's all about kind of where you are, who you've interacted with, what was your experience, who's validating the language you're using very often, who's going like, no, Wade, you're doing great. And it's like, oh, okay, thank you. Because if they're telling you like, that's not a word, stop it. Like, and they're picking you apart, it's like, okay, never mind. Like, it makes, it can be discouraging. So it's really, really interesting how sometimes those conversations go in another direction when really these are things I feel we've been interacting with and talking about all of our lives. It just maybe wasn't in the context of teaching it. I don't know if that
Right.
makes sense.
Well, and I believe that these are conversations that we're going to have at some point. For example, with Spanish right now and the whole controversy around, like the term Latinx or Latine, which one is more correct, which one is more inclusive, and like in our language, like when we talk about other races of people, we go by color. I mean, like Asian people, we just refer to them as ani talonege, which means yellow people,
Oh,
and we talk about Black people as ani ganeke, which is black, literally black people, we refer to white people. We have an old word, like the new word, we say ani yonek, which means actually white people, but our old word says sakonu ani sakonege juwadun, which means the blue veined people, because you could see the veins through their skin, and so that's what we call them.
okay. Not wrong, but I feel a little bit seen.
Right? Yeah, it's like, I'm triggered, but
A little bit. Accurate.
yeah, but and as speakers, we don't assign any kind of connotation to it or whatever. It's just that's how we describe people, but in the future we're going to have to look at those terms, and what are we going to use alternatively to be, if we expect our language to be revitalized and to be used in any meaningful way in the modern era,
Right. Well, and watching language evolve to be, or not even watching, that feels passive, like crafting language to be sensitive and responsive to the different conversations we're having, and all those kind of things. Like if the word didn't exist, like, well, we've always said, like yellow, and you're like, like I don't know that that's what we want to do. Like, can we maybe do some literally anything else?
Right, yeah.
Kind of responding to that. And I think that, I mean, like Latin has had to do over and over. I've constantly asked like Latin teaching colleagues, like, what's the word for? They're like, okay, you're not remembering. There isn't one for that. Like, they just have to make it up, and it's like the box that with 4 wheels is a car, or whatever. And things like that, just watching that kind of natural evolution, but yet people still get upset. And I think there's like not upset, but like, well, you can't do that. Well, says who? Right? I mean, there are no, it's like Bill Van Patten said earlier this spring, we language teachers want to make all these rules for things. That's how we teach things. We teach, well, the rule is, but then language goes and breaks all the rules. So the truth is there are no rules. Like it's just, it's kind of, it does whatever it wants, and then it breaks all of the patterns that it looks like it has. So you end up having kind of rules about rules, or language that's set in stone, and it just never has been. So things like that, if like, oh, we should change that, and if someone were to argue that, it's like, what are you actually arguing? Like, that might be a separate conversation. Is it the words that you're finding, that you think we're compromising? Like, do you think we're losing language? But inclusion, including more is never excluding any.
Right.
So there's
Right.
enough for everybody.
Absolutely, and it will evolve. Whenever I used to teach high school, right now I work for the tribe, but I used to teach high school, and most of the kids at the school where I taught, I taught in my hometown, where is 85% of the people there were Cherokee. So most of the kids that I had, their parents were speakers, but the kids were, passive understanders of the language, maybe, what we would call like heritage, learners, that kind of thing. But some of the slang that they would come up with in Cherokee used to just crack me up, because I would understand it, but it was just hilarious, like because this was back like in the 90s, early 2000s, you know, like when Suck It became really popular, you know. So they were there. So one of the kids went home and they asked their grandma, hey, grandma, how do you say suck on something, you know, or whatever. And so they would tell, and so they crafted this slang that has never existed before in our language, you know. You know, and it's like when we say goodbye, you know, or whatever, they would say like later. We a speaker would never ever use the word later in that context,
right.
ever, you know, but they knew what you meant when you said it, you know, so they're like, oh, okay, you know, they're like, oh, that's some young people, you know. But I think it's fascinating to see them playing with the language and manipulating the language like that, and you know, taking ownership of it. And you know, there are days that I wake up and I'm like, oh, that's horrible, that's terrible, you know, and we should preserve it, it should be pure, you know. But there are other days that that my curmudgeon days, you know. But ultimately I do realize that when we hand the language off to those younger generations, it becomes theirs to do with what they need to do with it, you know, and that it's not up to us to watchdog it, and to, it's just to pass it on to the best of our ability, and hopefully pass on the ways of thinking and the ways of doing and the ways of knowing that go along with it, that deeper understanding. For example, our word for I love you doesn't really mean that. Like when people, if you ask a Cherokee speaker, they say, oh, how do you say I love you? Because that's what everybody wants to know, right? Everybody wants to know, how do you say I love you in your language, you know? And we're like, oh, well, you would say you. But what that really truly means is that I am stingy with your existence, that I don't want to share you with your time with anybody else. And that's what Gageyu truly means, you know. And so it doesn't really mean love, you know, but to us, that's the closest that we could come in our language, you know. And so to explain people, you know, like for example, we have this thing that we tell people, we say which means, literally it means to do this to somebody, but the deeper understanding of that, it means that we all hold on to one another, and if one person falls down, we're all going to fall down together, and we're going to stay down until all of us can stand back up again together. And that's what that word to a speaker really, really means. And so our hopes are that we can convey that to them, so that they're respectful of the language enough that they'll treat it with the respect that it deserves. And there are ways of thinking and ways of dealing with the world that are unique to who we are as a people. And that's one of the most important things about how language encapsulates culture. And you know, are these little concepts like that you just can't get in any other way, you know.
Well, you can't get it when you look at culture in a secondary way either. You know, I was recently asked, like, how do you incorporate culture into your teaching? And I said, I think we need to flip that question. Or how do you incorporate culture into language? And I said, I think we need to talk about how do we incorporate language into culture? Because when you lead with culture, you lead with emotion, you lead with incredibly beautiful sentiments like that. You know, I mean, but these beliefs, like that's products, practices, perspectives, yada yada. I mean, it's like all of it. That's where you go from there. Don't start with the other part, you know, the linguistic part, and then, oh, by the way, I mean, you know, that can be so powerful for learners, but also, like you said, to really, really start to grasp what is meant by some of those linguistic sentiments, which isn't just like, oh, I got your back, you know, or like that kind of thing. It's like, no, it's like a little bit deeper than that. It's sort of that it takes what I hear you saying is it takes a village. It's a, you know, one for all for one kind of a thing, but like deeper and really,
Right, yeah.
really, like you said, going beyond I love you. And it's like, no, you're mine.
Yeah, exactly.
You're all for me. Yeah, like I am not sharing you, which like incredible.
Yeah.
Because
well, you know, it's kind of like whenever I was learning Spanish, and my teacher talked about the word ojalá, you know.
Oh, love.
And then she explained, she was like, well, this is really where it comes from. This is the root of it, you know. And I'm like, whoa, that's like a lot. I mean, you know,
Right.
whereas, you know, if we're just teaching it, we're like, oh, ojalá means, you know, if only, or whatever,
Right,
you know.
right. Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, and even how it makes me think of how we kind of talk in hyperbole all the time anyway. Like we say, oh, I love French fries, you know, like I
Yeah.
love cheese. And it's like, do you love French fries? Like, I
Yeah.
mean, like we say, oh, that was awesome, or that was amazing. And it's like, you know, hilarious. And there's
Yeah.
comedian Louis C.K. who does a bit on hilarious, like, oh, that's hilarious. When really hilarious is like so funny it almost made you lose your mind. You know, that's what
Right. Yeah.
hilarious, like hilarity, like that's what that means. That like you almost had a breakdown, but we go, oh, that's hilarious, you know, and everything's like, and it's maybe funny, you know, but not
Right. Yeah.
certainly not hilarious. And I don't wonder if that's not some of that like right? Like Kelly said in the chat, like we say, oh, hilarious, but no one's laughing. It's like clearly
Right.
not. We say LOL, but we're not actually laughing out loud. We're just typing like, we smirk. We need smirking out loud. We need SOL, but that's something else. That one's already taken. But like, you know, I think we do that with language over time anyway. And some of those are great reminders of like, let's be really specific sometimes about the language we're using. Like, is something hilarious, or like, oh, that was really enjoyable, that was humorous, like kind of avoiding hyperbole in those ways, because yeah, some sentiments in other languages are stronger than maybe meets the eye.
Right. You know, and that's made me more cognizant of the English that I use, you know,
Exactly.
because um, the way the way I work is, you know, I'll develop, I'll be like, well, okay, well, I want to tell one of our traditional stories, for example, you know, but I want to make it accessible. So I want to make it simple. So I'll simplify, I'll use, you know, kind of that embedded reading kind of concept. And I'll, you know, make 3 or 4 versions, and I'll, you know, make a super simple. But then whenever I go to my speakers, and then I'm at the point now where they want me to try to translate it myself, and then they rip it apart, you know, but that's good. You know, it's good for my learning.
Thank you.
Yeah. They're like, okay, every single word about in this, but you
Mostly
know,
wrong, good try. Okay, I'm fine.
yeah, but we're glad that you made the effort, you know.
Oh, okay.
But I've had to learn to be really, really specific about what I really mean when I write the English, because I'll write it in English how I would, you know, like for example, how I'm talking to you. And I would write it that way, and I would put it to them, and they're like, yeah, you can't say that in our language. And I'm
Mm,
like, okay, well, this is one of our traditional stories. So, you know, and so I would have to really think, you know, for example, you know, things like pulling your leg, or you know, those like idioms, or and things that we don't even consider idioms in English anymore because they're so commonplace. I put them, and then when they try to put them into Cherokee, they're like, yeah, that makes absolutely no sense in our language because you're not really meaning what you really mean, you
mm,
know. They're like, you know, and so they've really, my speakers are just fabulous. They're really such wonderful educators to me, in that they always make me think
mm.
about what I really truly mean, you know. And they're like, well, you say this, but what do you really mean when you're trying to say that? Talk to me about it, you know.
Right,
Who-
right. Explain that to me. Right.
Yeah. And so then we'll have, you know, a 5-minute long conversation about this one sentence, and about what I really mean it to do. And
Mm,
then they're like, oh, okay, this is what you want, you know.
right.
So,
Like that's what I said. That's what I said.
yeah, exactly.
So funny. Well, I even think about the cultural implications too. And I was talking to a colleague about the Chilean colleague the other day, and she was like, what did she say in English? But it was so funny. But it was closer to the Spanish. She said like, she was like, she's like, I I don't want you to offend yourself, but, and I was like, oh, that's so funny that you say that, because in Spanish, no offense is don't offend yourself. Like you did that to you, Wade. I didn't.
Yeah, it's all on you.
I said this horribly offensive thing, but like I didn't.
Yeah,
That wasn't. that was you.
Yeah, exactly.
I think culturally, from a language that says like, hey, chubby one, come here. And, all these other things, like all of these like physical appearance based,
Yeah.
comments and nicknames and affection. I'm like, oh yeah, don't offend yourself. Makes sense. That feels on brand. But
Yeah.
but the cultural implications are so funny because, and I'm thinking of obviously being a native speaker of American English, like US English, like I think like, no offense. And then I realize how kind of passive that is. And I think, maybe we should kind of go to like, don't offend yourself.
Yeah, don't offend yourself. Yeah.
Like, hey, don't offend yourself, but I'm going to say something really horribly offensive. But it's just interesting, all of the things, like you said, that come with that. And then once someone understands your sentiment, they go, oh, okay, yeah, there's a way to say that. And you're like,
Yeah,
why
I
didn't
totally
you?
say that.
Geez Louise, like, why didn't you just say that? Or how did it take us that long to get to this like mutual understanding kind of a thing? But that's language, like,
Yeah.
just in so many ways.
And that's the fabulous thing about other cultures, because things that we think of as being offensive in English, to a speaker of Spanish, they're like, who cares?
Grow up, get thicker skin, right? You're
Yeah,
like,
they're like, suck it up, And I've been involved in Chinese martial arts for the past 20 some years,
cool.
and my instructor is from Hubei. So English is his second language, and he's so funny because he's just so matter of fact about things. I had stopped training for an amount of time because I had an injury. And so I just stopped. I got depressed because I was getting older, and all that kind of stuff. And so I went back and I said, well, I want to start training to go to Worlds. I want to try to make the US team, go to China and compete. And he just kind of looked at me and I said, and he was like, well, we'll have to get back in the gym and you'll have to, work at it. And I said, yeah, I'm going to have to lose some weight. And he was like, yeah, he said, maybe lose about 5-10 pounds and da-da-da. And I said, well, I thought of losing more like 15 or 20. And he was like, oh, good. So you're aware. He was like, I didn't want to say that. He's like, because I didn't want to be rude. He's like, but he said, when you came in, he said, ni pala, he was like, I thought, oh, you're fat.
Oh, you've got it.
Yeah, but to him, it's just like, oh, hey, whatever. I'm telling you this out of love. You're a chunky monkey, dude.
Right, exactly. You're a chunky monkey. Like, you've gotten a little fat. Okay, thank you. I'm aware. Like,
yeah, but I love that. I love that about him, and and of course, coming from a native community, we're like that too. We tease really, really hard,
right,
and they just tell it like it is. I mean, they're super polite about it, but they'll just tell you like it is. They don't care. Like our word, like galjohit, that means in Cherokee, that's galjohit means like fat, but that almost means like you're as big as a house, sort of. I mean, like it has that like connotation to it. Like galjode, yeah.
I love you say it with more, like, I mean,
Yeah.
God, that's so funny. I can remember one of my first native speaker conversations. You know how you rehearse? I know they say like, you're not supposed to role play, but you know how you role play in your head. You're like, and then I'm gonna say, and she's gonna say, and then I'm gonna say. Like, it's not a scripted workbuk thing, but it's like, don't worry, I've played this all out in my head. Stranger. Yeah. So like, I'll tell you what.
I have all the conjugations. I'm ready.
Exactly. I've got the conjugations. I hope we stay in the present tense. Like, and I remember being like early Spanish too. And sitting, and Shakira, it was like, Shakira, it was still brown-haired Shakira, right? She hadn't gone mainstream. She belonged to the people. She was ours. And I had one of her like tapes. And so I was like, okay, my Spanish teacher told me about Shakira, and Shakira's from Colombia, because this lady on this plane, I heard speaking Spanish to somebody like before the flight took off. And so I was like, that seems like Spanish. I'm in Spanish too. Okay. And then I heard her, she was speaking. So I was like, oh, hola, like, where are you from? I'm hitting her with my Spanish 1, like early Spanish 2 questions. How old are you? Where are you from? What do you do? Like all of those kind of things. And she mentioned being from Colombia. And I was like, ooh, Shakira is from Colombia. And I, so we were chatting, whatever. And she was like, oh, you're learning Spanish, like whatever. And then she said, so she was like, I'm learning English. That's funny. So we were kind of going back and forth. And she said, oh, did we lose Wade? Oh, Wade Cito, come back. Oh, there you are. She said, hold on, let me, boop, there we go. And we're back. Amazing. God, that's the story of this year, isn't it? I'm gone, I'm here. I'm gone, I'm here. But she said, oh, you are so big. And I was like, oh my God, like, okay, like Joe said in the chat, like, I hadn't yet gone places to be called like Gordita, or they would always call me La Rubia Grande. Is my perpetual name, because I'm like not even that tall, but I'm taller than everybody. And it was so funny. You are so big. And I was like, oh my God. But then we stood up at the end of the plane ride, and I realized she was like maybe 4'11", like, and I'm 5'7". So, I mean, we've got like significant, and I was like, oh, tall, like I'm tall. And she was like, yeah, you are tall. And I was like, okay, let's talk about the word big. Okay. Like, easy there, lady. But it was that same thing. It was that same like cultural implication of like, excuse me. I am horrified.
Yeah, exactly. But that's what I love about, other cultures and things is, how they deal with things like concepts that we think of as universal, things like respect, politeness, honesty, love, caring,
Right. If you really love somebody, would you just be like, no, you haven't, I don't even notice a change? Yes, you do. Like, I'm telling you because I love you.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, why would we? Oh my God, that's so funny. Oh, I'd forgotten about that. Now I'm gonna be upset about it. No, I'm kidding. It's been 20 years. Let it go. Like, oh man. Man, that's so funny.
Like tapes.
Oh, is that me? Oh, all of a sudden I was like, I could hear myself. Oh, yeah, I'm on the thing. That's funny. I was like, wait, where did I go? I could hear me. I was just going to ask you one last question. I know we've gone like several minutes over, but I just wanted to ask you if you had, you mentioned methodology before, and obviously working, to provide comprehensible input. What are the methods that you found? I don't know. Did you see a lot of parallels in the things that you were seeing, like commonly taught language colleagues do, et cetera? Like, were you able to draw a lot of parallels, or were there certain aspects of teaching Cherokee, and as you continue, obviously we continue learning, like things that you were like, that's a little bit different, but I can adjust? I don't know if you saw one way or the other.
Well, I was originally not a CI fan. I went to college for Spanish education, and I came from a very literature, grammar based university when it came to all of that. And so they gave us a lot of very traditional methodologies. They kind of mentioned TPR in our textbook, and that was like it. So I started working for Cherokee Nation, and I became friends with Dessa, and she was like, oh, you teach Cherokee? She was like, you should look at this methodology called TPRS. And she was like, this would be fabulous for you because, you're a story-based culture and da-da-da-da-da. And I was like, oh, this is just a bunch of, like hippie mumbo jumbo. I was like, so I was nice to her. I was like, oh yeah, that's really sweet, but yeah, no thanks, but she kept on me, and she was like, well, she said, come to Tulsa. She said, we're having a meeting, and she said, I really want you to observe this teacher, and they'll feed you for free. And I was like, okay, yeah, I'm there. I'm like, I'm on it. So I drive to Tulsa, and I watch Darcy Pippins, and I watch her elementary Spanish. And these are kids that are like, I don't know, 6, 7, 8, 9 years old, in Spanish 1. And they're like retelling stories in Spanish. And I'm like, dude, I was like, if I had kids who could do this in Cherokee, I could die happy, because we are not at that level. I was like, what is this lady doing to do this? And she was like, oh, it's TPRS. Because at the time, that was way before the CI switch. you know. So I was like, yes, I want to learn all about this. So my tribe sent me to be trained, and I went to IFLT, and Ben Slavic was my first coach, and it was like insane, you know, and everybody felt sad for me, and they were like, oh my gosh, you know, they were like, you know, but and so that kind of started me on my journey, and I really find that CI, I mean, yes, it's a set of strategies, but really it's also a methodology and a pedagogy as well, you know. And so you can kind of right now, I use a lot of Dr. Benico Mason's work, just because of the format that I'm in right now. Right now, I'm recording for PBS. So all of my hard-won practice in questioning and circling and story asking, I can't do, because I have no, you know, I have no like audience in when they record me. It's just me and a camera. So I'm like, how am I going to do CI when I can't get my reps by doing circling, you know, when I can't ask questions? And I've noticed that for Cherokee speakers and for Cherokees, that the whole circling and questioning is culturally very difficult.
Wow.
Yeah, because we're just not, that's just not a part of our culture, is to just ask question after question after question after question. And so whenever I work with first language speakers, that's really difficult to get them to do, is to ask questions.
Right.
And they just don't. And so there have been a few things, you know, um, one word image has been very difficult culturally, because they get into situations where you know, you have something that's inanimate, but all of a sudden it has animate characteristics. And so linguistically for us, because those are different words in our language, we use different verbs for something that's alive and something that's not alive. And so it kind of, if we get into certain territories, it kind of weirds them out. They're like, I don't know how to talk about this because that doesn't exist in the real world. You know,
Do that, right?
right? They're like, I don't know how to do that in the language because it's inanimate, so I should be using this, yet it's holding a conversation. So you know. But right now, I'm really into Dr. Benico Mason's work, and really looking at her research and what her findings are. And I've really found, I taught part of my Cherokee 1 for PBS that way. And I found that was what they enjoyed the most. And that's what they got the most gains out of. So now that I'm doing Cherokee 2, I'm using almost all stories. And, you know, and I'm not spending a lot of time with 3 structures. I'm not, you know, doing, you know, all of that I was trained to do. And I'm just telling the story and making it comprehensible. And I'm finding that it's working. And that's just kind of blowing my mind a little bit, because cerebrally, I'm like, this should not work. You know, this shouldn't be effective. But as long as you're really talking about keeping it comprehensible, I'm finding that it is really, it's really working for me and for our culture. So I've really been a big fan lately, and again, you know, I'm very conservative. I'm real slow to change. You know, I thought I was going to be doing circling till my dying day. You know, so and I still do, like if I'm doing live classes, I still use that a lot. And now that I feel like I have a really deep understanding of circling and psychologically what that does, and psychologically how to use it, I feel like I can do it well. So I do use it quite a bit if I'm doing live in-person classes. But I have to say that I'm really enjoying my foray into Dr. Benico Mason's work, as well as Tina Hargaden and her framework that she's been using about cycles of instruction, especially for people like me who has no curriculum and we have to develop it like just, out of thin air.
Right.
It gives me, her cycles of instruction gives me something to bite onto. It's like, okay, well, cycle 1, description. Okay, let's describe,
Right.
let's describe our setting. Let's talk about character. Let's talk about dialogue, and so it really helps me keep myself organized, because I'm not naturally an organized person. So her work, I feel like, has some really good applications, especially for beginner teachers, because they can take something and they can still change it to make it theirs, but it gives you, you have this vast ocean of language that you can dip into. And according to kind of the CI mindset, it's like, well, just jump in. And it's like, but where do I start? What do I start with? Yeah. And they're like, just wherever, anywhere. And it's like, no, where do I start?
Maybe you didn't understand my question. I said where.
Yeah, exactly. So I really found that what she's been doing lately has really helped, especially beginner teachers, kind of give you at least a place to start. It's like, oh, describe setting. Okay, done. I can do that. We're working on adjectives,
Like, well, exactly, because it can all feel so like frou-frou and hoo-hoo and wahoo and like, oh, like, Wade, how do you teach? And I have this conversation with like 2 or 3 people like a couple times a year where I'm like, oh, knock it off. You're not helpful. And, we laugh because it's like, you might say, I just teach stories and I just, my lesson plans, ha 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 ha. That's funny, lesson plans. I don't lesson plan. I just tell stories with my kids. And I'm like, listen, buddy, like, I have 13 people in my department. I got 36 kids looking at me. I can't just like sit on a stool in the middle of class and be like, what do you all want to talk about? There's a curriculum. Yeah. Okay. And there's an end of semester exam. Like, we can't, geez Louise, we got to look at the practicality of things and, the practical applicability and like all of those things. If you're in a classroom, if you're in kind of a traditional setting, like, where do you start? And then what do you tell people who, like you said, are slow to change, but even just like medium to change or quick to change, like all of that's going to happen in such nuanced, like different processes kind of way. Like, give people something, give them a place they can start and a concept they can think about, and they can, something concrete that's like, okay, try this. Like you said, descriptions. Okay, I'm thinking adjectives, I'm thinking some identifying verbs, I'm thinking, great, start there. That isn't so like, I don't know, whatever, like vague and nebulous that people like, oh, well, screw it. Then I'm not going to try this because like you've made it so unattainable that like, I don't know what to do. And who wants to feel that way?
Right. And another aspect of kind of that work that she's doing has made me more aware that, for example, if all you do is tell stories, fiction stories, then you're hitting the past tense really heavy.
Right.
But, that's about it, But
right.
If you add dialogue, then you're dealing with first and second person in the present tense a lot of, more times than not.
Right.
And so and so by her delineating that, I find that I'm hitting a lot more.
Yep.
And then she's like, okay, well, let's move on to persuasive writing. Let's move on to presentational writing. So then we move into nonfiction, which deals more with the habitual tense and the present tense and things like that. So I'm like, oh yeah, so I just really encourage people to take a look at that framework, because it will help you regardless of what you're doing. You're like, okay, well, now I need to make sure that I have some presentational writing in what I present. I can't just do traditional stories all the time, because then all we're doing is past tense. And
right. And we're not also circulating through the modes. Like, there's nothing, they're not ever getting any other, really, what are you doing and how often? And man, I've said this earlier in the series, but my first job, my first teaching job, they asked me at the interview, are you trained in, and they, same thing, TPRS, you know, and I was like, well, yeah, I was not.
Yeah.
I don't think I understood the
do it.
question. Yeah, I think I thought they were asking if I knew what it meant. And so I was like, obviously. And they were like, great. And I got the job. And then later I was like, oh, like I have.
It's like, oh, dang.
Yeah, I know. I was like, I have erred. Like this is the whole department was like, you know, Green Bible. Like they had the like the stories. Look who, oh, I forgot what the first one is, but look who can speak now. Look what I can read. Whatever it is, whatever. It was like Blaine Ray all day, whatever. And their kids were incredible. But I was like, hold on. This is not how I was taught to teach. I think I lied in the interview unintentionally. How did I get here? Like, what are we doing?
Right.
But it was like 2 days after I graduated college, and I was like, yeah, I need a job. Sure, I'm trained in that. That seems like a thing I've heard of. Great.
Yeah.
Like, I'm your
I could
gal.
totally do that.
Oops. Like, sorry. I'm still apologizing to those colleagues. Like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I didn't know. I didn't know didn't understand the question. So I just answered what I thought they were asking. But yeah, it was not how I was trained to teach either. And really, it's not how I learned in obvious ways. But when I look back now, I'm like, oh yeah, it is kind of how I learned in a couple ways, but it wasn't, you know, it wasn't explicit like that. But it's fascinating that you have seen and experienced the same parallels. So that's like
well,
heartening, but interesting.
Yeah. My first teaching job, I was teaching Spanish, and you know, I took my, you know, my master's degree in education, you know, and all my student teaching experience, and walked into the class, and, you know, and I was like, you know, hola clase, este año vamos a hablar solamente en español, ninguno en inglés, you know, and they all just, and they're like, what? And I would speak to them in nothing but Spanish for like the first week, and they would all just look at me like I'm an idiot. And so then I would just get frustrated, and I'm like, okay, open the book to page 5.
Never mind.
And
right.
Let's, you know, and let's do that, and let's watch movies, you know, because I would just get, I just got so frustrated as a teacher. And I really wish I had been exposed to CI earlier in my career. I would have been a much more effective teacher, because I knew what I wanted. I wanted my kids to be able to speak the target language. I wanted them to be able to understand when I would talk to them. I had no clue how to get there. I thought immersion was just, I talk to them and somehow magically they pick it up, you know?
Yeah, it's magic. Hello.
Yeah, exactly. And that's because that's all I had been, you know, because other than grammar, that's all I knew, you know. And at the time, immersion was a big deal, and dual language, and you know, so I was like, okay, immersion, I could totally do that. I could talk to them in Spanish, no problem, you know. How hard can that be, you know? And so
famous last words, how hard can that be?
Yeah, totally. And so I just got so burnt out and so frustrated as a teacher that, you know, I just gave up, and I'm like, okay, let's do the DMA book, and let's just, you know, just forget it. And you know, and really, I guess that's I wish that university programs would allow people to explore more CI, because I feel like they would be much happier when, and much better prepared when they entered the teaching world. You know, because I mean, I was a sucky teacher. I tell everybody, I was a horrible teacher. My kids didn't learn crap. I mean, you know, they learned el burro sabe más que tú. That is what they came out. That's what they came out with, you know. And I mean, you know, they all liked me, and because I was the cool teacher, and they all got an A, you know, or whatever. But as far as actually teaching them something, I really failed, you know, because I didn't know how to get where I wanted to go.
That is so relatable. I felt like I feel seen. I feel triggered. No, I'm kidding. But like, that's exactly it. Is in those first couple years, sometimes, you know, you want to try all the things, and yet you don't know how to try any of the things. And so, like you said, you try it, and then you're like, oh, screw it. Never mind. I knew this was like back to page 38, and what comes after 38, 39, like whatever. And which is a little bit of self-fulfilling prophecy too, of you're like, oh, I knew this was just like woohoo, wahoo, hippie, like whatever. But it really, like, it's realizing what your kids can't do that makes you realize that for me, I say I realized what, like you said, that my kids didn't know anything. Like, we'd learned a little Spanish, but like we weren't in Spanish. I was teaching about Spanish. I wasn't teaching in Spanish. And they learned so little that I realized several years in, like, relationships and rapport were completely masking a lack of pedagogy. Like, they liked me, I liked them. I was the favorite. Oh, Miss White or Miss McDonald. Oh, you're the best. Da, 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 da. Love you. You're my favorite. Spanish is my favorite. And I was like, ego. Like, keep it coming, because this wasn't a miserable experience. Like, I got you, Zach. All right, no problem. Da, 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 da. And then, like, Zach ain't no Spanish. Like, he's not learning anything. And it's like, they could do tango, tienes, tiene, tenemos, tienen, whatever, and let's call it a day. And then you start to see people, like you said, you go to like Darcy, incredible, like up for ACTFL Teacher of the Year a few years ago, like, oh, amazing. And you see that and you go, how did you do that though? And you start to unravel kind of how you were taught, but also your expectations. That for me was when I realized, oh, my kids don't know anything. Like, they're not reading at a high level. People's kids, like 3 days into school, were writing like pages. How people share like on social media, like, what their students are writing, and they're like, oh, week 3, Spanish 1. And I'm like, week 3? Like,
I can barely do that now.
Right, thank you. I'm like, that kid used that kid knows Vosotros? I don't know Vosotros. Like, oh my goodness. And that was really like, I really don't. Which apparently is not anyway, Spanish teachers get very annoyed with that. But I'm like, teach it, I would have to learn it. Like, I was self-conscious about that. And then I became self-conscious about the fact that my students weren't learning what I thought they did. But I was also always student blaming. I was like, oh, it's so hard to teach Sarah and a Star. Oh, they just never understand. But I wasn't teaching it comprehensively. I was teaching it like prescriptively and completely like form before function. Like, of course they didn't. It's a hard concept. It's late acquired. And it kind of doesn't matter in like 90% of contexts.
Right. So why do we? It's like here are the rules for sad. Here are the rules for sad.
Right.
Let's memorize them.
Let's memorize them and then knock ourselves. And then still, like, a native speaker will use one of them in a way that I'm like, like, why did you do that there? Why would you have done? Or you see these message boards that, like, one of my favorite groups on Facebook is How Do You Say? It's called just How Do You Say for Spanish teachers, and people just post of like leggings, like, how do you say leggings? Because I'm on Corte Ingles's website and they just say literally like los leggings. Like, does anybody have a word for that? And you get all these cool perspectives of people chiming in and stuff like that. It's just fascinating how we kind of evolve, and like you said, get kind of cranky about things, and then you see differently and you go, okay, but also how do you continue to mix that with who you're working with, what you also know works in this other way? Like, we've all got to kind of do this balance thing a lot of times. And that can be hard. I think sometimes methodologies or systems of strategies, I should say, or different things, like staying comprehensible, like teaching proficiency through reading and storytelling, all of those can seem one way or no way. Like, you're either all in or no. And I don't think that's the case for most people. Most people have to work within a department, or they've got good old DMA. Or they Avancemos is ours. I think is ours. Yeah, Avancemos. I had to think what our book was. Ooh, so you can see how often we use that. And but they've got these things they've got to kind of reconcile with each other. And I think it gets a little dangerous when we ignore that and make people feel like it's all or nothing, or you're either all in or you're not, or you use all the strategies or none, or you have this big personality that is required. Like, no, it's not. No, it's not.
Mm-mm. And that's what I've really learned in exploring what Dr. Benico Mason is doing, because everything that I kind of was taught is CI, kind of is thrown out the window in a way.
Right.
And so it really forces you to look at Dr. Stephen Krashen's work and say, okay, am I keeping it comprehensible? Am I giving them enough repetition? Am I making it engaging and important to them? You know, am I keeping their affective filter low? You know, as long as I'm doing those things, then it's CI, you know, and yeah, you have a lot of purists that are like, oh, well, if you're not, you know, using a yes, no question and an either or question and an open-ended question, and then you don't do one word image and you don't, you know, and they're like, well, you're not a real CI teacher. It's like, no, as long as you're following, you know, what the research is telling us on how people are acquiring, then you're doing some good.
Yeah.
I promise.
Right. I promise. Like the kids are going to be okay. I mean, we didn't kill them when we did page 38 and 39 and 40. You know, I mean, like,
yeah, totally. They didn't die.
They didn't die. They seemed fine. So, that's so funny. Yeah, I think it's really dangerous when we do that with anything. When we say like, when we think of it like when we look at language in a binary way, I'm like, but we all know that, again, I could say to Joe, like, I don't even know the Vosotros, and he could be horrified. I'm just knowing him because he's a Spanish teacher and a Spanish speaker. Same thing with Kelly. She might go, "Ew, why do you say that word?" And then you're like, I don't know. That's the word I know. What's the word? Like, there's so much that's not binary in the conversations that we have collegially, socially, what we're listening to. You know, I get that it's like, we as teachers, we don't have always a lot of control or flexibility. So we try to control what we can. And we're like, nope, I'm not doing this, or I'm doing only this or whatever. But, you know, that's hard to say what's best for other people to do, you know, individually. So it's, I think, important acknowledging that, like, it's a process, you know, like you said, because it totally was for me too. I was like, I'll try this thing. And then I kept seeing more and more people. And I was like, wow, I'm not comprehensible. Like, I'm, you know, like, I'm not only not giving comprehensible input, I'm not giving any input. First of all, like, we are 90-10, girl, 10-90. Like, I had a kid keep a stopwatch, and I was like, and she's in Spanish, and it was like, I was calculating, I was like, ew, this is like 20% of the time on a good day. And in my mind, I was like, we're speaking Spanish. No, you're reading the paragraph that they're reading along with. That is not input. Like, stop it. You're a liar to yourself. Yeah. So really coming to terms with some of the things that, you know, that we're doing and that we're not doing, and like what's really going on. But like you said, really backed up by the research and by what we know to be true, at least for us, in our own experience from what we know. And then you just kind of do the best you can from there, I think, you know, I mean.
Right. Yeah.
The ebb and flow, and that changes every year too. I think, especially this year, it's like, okay, yeah, there's several things we're not going to make happen over Zoom. So
yeah. Well, you know, I do a lot of teacher education for Indigenous teachers, and you know, like, I have one teacher that is just really, really into repeat after me. You know, and yeah, I know, and I was just like, and somebody point blank asked me, because they knew a little about CI, and she was there, and they were like, so what do you think about repeat after me? And I was like, and she's a first language speaker, by the way.
Oh, geez.
Yeah, and I said, let's look at it this way. I said, you're not hurting your students really by making them do that, but research shows us that if you only have a finite amount of time to give them language, that it may not be the most efficient use of your time, that a better use of time is giving them input, because when they're doing an output activity, which repeat after me is, they're not getting any input at that point, you know. And I said, you know, so I said, if you're in a classroom where you have them every single day, 5 days a week, you know, 1 hour a day, you know, 180 days out of the year, then yeah, a little repeat after me is not going to kill you. But I get to see my students once a week for 2 hours, you know, and so I've got to throw out all that stuff that doesn't serve me, you know, because I've got a finite amount of time. So I want to get the most effective stuff in there that I can, and it just doesn't. Yeah, and so it just doesn't serve my needs. But I said, if you've got the time to do it, then hey, knock yourself out, go for it, you know.
Yeah, Well, yeah, and I think that's a really lovely way of saying that because, it would be really easy to go like, don't do that, ineffective, and then that person's totally turned off to anything you have to say. And you're like,
Absolutely,
"Oh,
yeah.
okay." Like not productive, not helpful, also not sensitive to, their needs or their experience or like whatever the reason is that they might go, no, I think it works. And it's like, I
Yeah.
think we also have to look at compliance because kids of yesteryear, were a lot more compliant. And I don't mean that like in a mean way, but I mean like you could say, I'm taking Cherokee, I'm taking Latin, I'm taking Spanish, and your teacher be kind of like repeat after me, and you're like, yeah, like kids would just be like, okay, tango, TNA, and they
Yeah.
might kind of go along with it. Whereas, we have so much information and we have so much input and like stimulus all the time in all areas of our life. Like I could just say the word, like I don't have children and I could be like diapers, diapers, diapers. And now my phone's absolutely going to give me a million ads for diapers, like it's
Yeah.
listening to us all the time. We get custom ads, custom things. You can, group texts and Instagram and Twitter and email and sales. I mean, sheesh, like we get so much information all the time thrown at us that I don't think kids are they buy into compliance based methods as they used to, like as generationally maybe they did before of just like, yeah, okay, I believe you, I trust you. They're like, I Googled that and what you just said is not true. And you're like, thanks a lot, Google. Like, how could you betray me like this? Shut up. But it's, that's just not who they are. It's not like sit and be quiet and, nod and that kind of thing anymore. And not that it ever like super was, but it seemingly was for a lot of teachers for a long time, because there was the don't disrespect the teacher, just say, yes, ma'am, no, sir, da 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 da. And now kids are like a little more critical, I think, in that way that is powerful, but disconcerting for a lot of people in our position of, at some point, repeat after me is like not going to fly because they're just not going to.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But then you have like if you're dealing with older kids or you're dealing with adults particularly,
right.
they feel like that should be an aspect of their class, or if they're coming from a different classroom or something and they're like, why are we not repeating this?
Yeah,
like,
we're never speaking. Right.
Yeah.
Not repeating,
so,
not speaking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so, and so then either I'll say, okay, well, we'll, because even I'll do a little bit. But I usually try to do it through song to get at least some output, so I've really been into children's songs lately, like I said, because I have a daughter. And so, and I really find like for our words and probably for like Seneca as well, some of our words are really, really perceived as being long, like I used to try to teach the word farmer, and in our language, we call it digalogiski, is our word for farmer, and trying to get kids to learn that word was really hard. Right. But then I did, the bingo song in Cherokee, and I could teach that word in 5 minutes, and they could say it, they could sing it at least,
Right. What?
I know, yeah. And I was like, wow, here I would fight and fight and fight, to try to get them to learn this word. And I could teach them in 5 minutes with a song. Right. And they're going to remember it years later. I still have kids that did summer camp with me 5 years ago, and they'll come up to me and sing the song,
Incredible. Like, you're like, you're welcome.
I'm like, whoa. And that brings up, the cultural importance and the importance in our brains about music and what plays in memory and especially in cultures where music was an important part of remembering ceremony, and I think there's something in our brains that just that tunes into tune and music and cadence and rhythm, and helps us, and so I've been really exploring that a lot lately. So
well, and it's, turn on like I have XM radio in my car, turn on like 90s on 9 and I'm like, yes, like 80s on 8. I know all the words. Turn on anything recent, I'm like, no, I'm not interested. Like, no, thank you. These kids these days and their music, whatever. But it's, because it's also like emotionally significant in the time, all of those things, whatever that connection is to the thing, you're like, oh, I remember we used to, And so when it's positive to associate with that too, that's so powerful, like so powerful. Man, wait, I'm so sorry that we went over into the after party, but I could talk, like we could talk about these things for forever. I can't thank you enough for your time and just your thoughts
thank
and
you
your
so
energy.
much.
No, I'm so glad we've finally been able to like meet because when I was talking to people about, I was like, who's the chair? I don't remember who it was. Maybe it was Megan, but it was somewhere I was like, Cherokee, who teaches Cherokee? And I've seen him on like our message board, like IFLT or, something, they're like, oh yeah, Wade. I was like, oh, Wade, like give me his email immediately. So I'm so thankful that you accepted our invite and just, again, your time and energy. You've given me so much to think about and so many incredible parallels between, which of course there are, but again, like in my ignorance, you don't know what you don't know. So many parallels between just language teaching regardless of the language, which is incredible, and just the cultural aspects of Cherokee that I didn't realize.
Yeah, and that's a big fallacy, especially in what we do in indigenous language. A lot of times we're real resistant. We're like, oh, well, that works for every other language but ours.
Right. Right.
It's like, well, why does it work for literally every language around the world, but it cannot be used for our language,
Right.
Yeah.
Interesting. It's almost like that teacher martyr thing too, of like, oh, like, but my situation is so unique or something, like, but this is really different, but you don't understand. I've encountered that with a couple of Navajo teachers who have said like, oh, I can't find, but there are no materials. And I was like, really? Like even like some stuff on like social media. And so I pulled up my phone in a workshop. We were looking at like things on Instagram, and they were like, oh, like what is this, kind of scrolling. And I was like, I'm not saying it's good. Like, I don't know what anything in here says, but it can be powerful for that. And a couple of things they found, and they were like, no, that's actually really inappropriate. And like, not inappropriate, but like appropriation. And so they were like, that's interesting. Well, there's a conversation topic, like talk about why it's not the thing and all that kind of things. But I think a lot of us, I know I've done it with my teaching situation, or you don't understand, oh, you don't understand my colleagues. Oh, you don't understand this. Like, but that won't work for me. But I think you're right. I think finding ways, things that do work, like looking for the commonality, not the reasons why something won't fit or won't work, are really, really powerful. Wow. That's so true. I think, yeah. Oof. Man, well, thank you so much. And thanks everybody who stuck around. Yes. Y gracias por, estar con nosotros. I just.
Gracias.
Sí, claro. I super appreciate it. Hopefully I'll see you. Hopefully in-person conferences will, I know,
I hope.
Oh, so we'll get to meet in real life, but thank you.
Ojalá, right?
Right. Ojalá. Yes.
Ojalá.
Perfect. Oh, absolutely perfect. Yeah. Well, thank you so much. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Wadon. Jadak sa